If the United States can spy on China, why can't China spy on the US? Washington's badly frayed relations with China were just starting to recover from the Chinese spy balloon that traversed the United States in early February before being shot down over the Atlantic Ocean. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, who had been forced to postpone his trip to Beijing because of all the hot air about the balloon flight, had finally rescheduled his visit for June 18. Then, last week, came word of a Chinese spy station in Cuba. In truth, there is nothing particularly scandalous about the latest revelations. It all began with a Wall Street Journal story on Thursday: Cuba to host secret Chinese spy base focusing on U.S. The article reported, citing anonymous U.S. officials familiar with highly classified intelligence, that China has agreed to pay cash-strapped Cuba several $billion to allow it to build the eavesdropping station, and described this as a brash new geopolitical challenge by Beijing to the U.S. Cue the predictable outrage from Capitol Hill. We are deeply disturbed by reports that Havana and Beijing are working together to target the United States and our people, said a joint statement from the chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee, Mark R. Warner, Democrat Virginia, and the vice chair, Marco Rubio, Republican Florida. We must be clear that it would be unacceptable for China to establish an intelligence facility within 100 miles of Florida and the United States. The chair of the House Intelligence Committee, Michael R. Turner, Republican Ohio, said in a tweet that he was deeply troubled by the report and added, if true, this would be yet another act of Chinese aggression. The number 3 House Republican, Elise Stefanik, New York, cited this as further evidence that President Biden has continually allowed Communist China to take advantage of his weak leadership and chip away at our national security. Then on Saturday, the White House said in a statement that China already had a spy base in Cuba. According to Biden administration officials, they inherited this issue from former President Donald Trump and have been working through diplomatic means to counter Chinese intelligence gathering in Cuba and elsewhere. China might be upgrading its intelligence presence in Cuba, but the presence itself isn't all that new or shocking. The Soviet Union had its largest overseas listening post near Lourdes, Cuba, for decades. The United States was willing to risk war to remove Soviet nuclear missiles from Cuba but tolerated those signals collection efforts. That's because Washington has long recognized that nations have a right to spy on one another. Indeed, the United States can hardly call out Chinese spying with a straight face when the U.S. intelligence community undoubtedly operates the largest signals collection network in the world. Revelations from Edward Snowden, the Discord leaks and other sources make clear the U.S. National Security Agency vacuums up vast amounts of communications from around the globe, spying on friends and foes alike. China knows all about U.S. collection efforts, not least because, after the establishment of relations between Beijing and Washington in the 1970s, China hosted NSA spy stations near its border with the Soviet Union. The Kremlin was undoubtedly unhappy about Project Chestnut but had to live with it. Nowadays, the United States regularly cooperates in intelligence gathering on China with allies such as Australia and New Zealand and sends its own surveillance aircraft near Chinese airspace. After a Chinese fighter aircraft flew too close in late May to a U.S. RC-135 aircraft, a signals intelligence platform known as the Rivet Joint, flying over the South China Sea, U.S. officials indignantly and rightly complained. But if the United States is allowed to spy near China, why isn't China allowed to spy near the United States? We should not be the least bit surprised by the possibility of a Chinese listening post in Cuba. The two countries have had an intelligence relationship for decades, Paul Heer, a former U.S. National Intelligence Officer for East Asia, told me. And any intelligence collection the Chinese do from Cuba would be roughly equivalent to U.S. collection against China from our allied listening posts and surveillance missions in the Western Pacific. Heer suggested that this story is being blown way out of proportion, perhaps, or presumably, by folks in Washington who are trying to subvert the Biden administration's efforts to revive engagement with Beijing. U.S. relations with Cuba could also suffer collateral damage from the latest revelations. Biden had lifted some Trump-era sanctions, but he has not normalized ties with Cuba, which has been under U.S. sanctions for more than 60 years. Is it any wonder that Cuba, facing a severe economic crisis aggravated by its central planning policies, might look to China for financial support? By leaving most of Trump's sanctions in place, the administration has left the Cubans no choice but to seek foreign patrons wherever they can find them if they want to survive, William Leo Grande, a Latin America specialist at American University, told me. The revelations should highlight the need for the United States to lift its sanctions and engage with Cuba to offset China's influence. But, more likely, they will have the opposite effect, making it politically impossible for Biden to improve relations with Cuba anytime soon. The bottom line is that we need to be more selective in our outrage. China carrying out genocidal policies against the Uyghurs, crushing freedom in Hong Kong or imprisoning dissidents, that's truly outrageous. Even sending a spy balloon over the United States was unacceptable, although the balloon's path was most likely inadvertent and not a calculated challenge from Beijing. China collecting signals intelligence from Cuba might be a cause for American discomfort, but it's no outrage, and it's no reason to blow up efforts to improve relations with Beijing. If the United States can spy on China, why can't China spy on the US? Washington's badly frayed relations with China were just starting to recover from the Chinese spy balloon that traversed the United States in early February before being shot down over the Atlantic Ocean. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, who had been forced to postpone his trip to Beijing because of all the hot air about the balloon flight, had finally rescheduled his visit for June 8. I lost 40 pounds on Ozempic. But I am left with even more questions. Well, if I gave it to you, you'd be the thinnest person I've ever prescribed it for. Thinnest was not a word I was accustomed to hearing in a sentence about me. I wasn't fat, exactly, but I was awfully close. At 5 feet and 152 pounds, my body mass index was 29.7, just shy of the 30 that is considered obese. More to the point, when I emailed my doctor on that day in October 2021, I was miserable. My clothes didn't fit. Looking at myself in photos, on the unfortunate occasions when I was caught on camera, was painful. There were more than a few fat pig comments from readers, and while I pretended to shrug them off, those words hurt. The slug for this essay, what it's called in the Post's internal system, is fat columnist, but that suggests a level of breezy self-acceptance that I never actually attained. I had been a skinny child. But Mrs. Whitman, my middle school home economics teacher, this was back in the day, was prescient when she caught me sneaking chocolate chips from the supply cabinet and warned that this kind of eating would one day catch up with me. It did. Puberty wasn't kind to me, pregnancy was bad and menopause even worse. Weight was a chronic issue but, for the most part, not an urgent one. I was always heavier than I wanted to be, but when I put my mind to it, I could shed enough pounds to look better, for a while. They say you always remember your first time, and I will never forget the slap-in-the-face sting of